Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our October installment of the New York City Neighborhood Naturalist Group, which is part of the New York City EcoFlora project. My name is Lydia Paradiso, and I'm a doctoral student at the New York Botanical Garden and a graduate fellow with the New York City EcoFlora project. NYBG first created the EcoFlora back in 2017 with a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. The EcoFlora is a community science project with three main goals: to investigate urban ecosystems and urbanization, to support open source biodiversity data, and to increase understanding and appreciation of plant life. To date, we've had nearly 30,000 observers make over 840,000 observations of plants and their biotic partners in New York City and had them posted on iNaturalist. You can explore these observations on our project page, which I will link in the chat. I'm also going to put a link to our webpage, which has a bunch of information about the project going back to 2017. You can also check out our YouTube page, which has recordings of all of our past talks. Another activity that we do with the EcoFlora is the EcoQuest Challenge, which is every month we encourage New Yorkers to observe a particular species or group of species and post those on iNaturalist. The EcoQuest for October is Falling for Galls. Galls are abnormal vegetative growths that develop on various plant parts in reaction to stimulus from insects, mites, nematodes, viruses, fungi, or even other plant species. The appearance of a gall is unique to the organism that creates it, and they can create a variety of bizarre and beautiful shapes, colors, and textures. So this month, take a closer look at some of your favorite plants and see if you can spot any galls. We'll be collecting them within the iNaturalist project here. If you make an observation and just post it onto iNaturalist, it will automatically go into our project. So quick announcements before we go into our talk for today. We have a couple events coming up planned. Next Monday, we're planning a plant awareness chalk walk in Brooklyn. We also have a BioBlitz planned at Bissell Gardens in the Bronx. That will be Sunday, the 23rd. Also, we're currently planning the 5th annual EcoFlora conference, which will be held virtually in the beginning of November on the 4th. The theme this year is community science in New York City, and we're going to have 5 speakers and the work that they have been doing in different community science projects here in New York City. So keep an eye out in your email for more updates on those. So now I'll turn it over to Tomi to introduce our speaker.
All right, so per usual, I am going to begin with a land acknowledgement by recognizing the original people of the land, the Lenape, as well as their deep connection to the Lenape-Hoking homeland. As an organization dedicated to advocating for the plant world, we must acknowledge those who were original stewards of this land and believe in the importance of acknowledging the settler colonial genocide perpetrated against the community and the resilience of the Lenape, who still today continue to resist erasure. So, as a reminder for the seminar you just signed up for, this is going to be about the Cleveland Pocket Prairie Project, which was a citywide study that examined the value of urban vacant lots as insect habitat. This was in Cleveland, Ohio, where Mary and her team transformed pocket prairies, vacant lands, into native wild pocket prairies. In this presentation, she will discuss how her team established and maintained these habitats, their value for bee forage, and how these pocket prairies were viewed by the local community. Mary Gardiner is a professor of entomology and co-director of the Ohio State University Environmental Sciences graduate program. Her research focuses on the ecology of vacant land and its potential to provide insect habitat and contribute to ecosystem services such as local food production, stormwater management, and climate resilience, all things that are extremely relevant to New York City. Gardiner advises MS and PhD students and teaches courses in public speaking and grant writing. So without further ado, I'll let your speaker take it away.
Thanks so much for that introduction. And it sounds like you guys have some awesome events coming up. Very exciting community science program. Sounds great. So I'm going to attempt to share my PowerPoint here. And we practice this, so hopefully it will work. Okay, so now it's sharing. Can you guys tell me if you're seeing the full screen?
Now we're seeing the presenter view.
Okay, so I need to do this, I think, to fix that. Has that fixed it?
Yes, perfect.
Very cool. Okay. So thank you all for being here this evening. It's a pleasure to present to this group. The way that I have my computer set up, it's not easy for me to see the chat while I'm presenting. And so if you could add your questions to the chat during the presentation, at the end of the presentation, I'll go ahead and go through the questions with you. But I'm very pleased to be here to tell you about my research project, which does focus on vacant land within a post-industrial city here in Ohio. And I am with Ohio State. So I wanted to tell just a little bit about myself. I am a professor of entomology, and the majority of my program is research. So I study the ecology of urban green spaces. I study vacant lots, but I also study residential land where people live. We look at things like how people design and manage their landscape, the context of their habitat within the landscape, and how forces like pollution or landscape change might influence the value of those green spaces for insects. As a professor, I get to work with a lot of talented graduate students. This is my current lab of graduate students. All of these folks are PhD students who study the ecology of vacant lots in one way or another. I also have an opportunity. Ohio State is a land grant institution, so we do a lot of outreach type programming. So I give talks like this, which is something I really enjoy. I also do community science research. I've studied lady beetle communities with the help of community scientists for several years. We've also dabbled into community science for youth with our Dandelion Detectives program, which is a program that we did during COVID. It's still available online. It's a free program and all the materials are there. It's very relevant to anywhere within the Northeast or North Central United States. I've written popular press books about beneficial insects, and we've also redone the Ohio forage curriculum, this Insect Adventures book series. When we redid this curriculum, the last time it had been redone, I could have taken it as a youth, so it was a very old curriculum. It was also very farm focused. We wanted to make the program focused to where kids in an urban environment would have everything they needed in their own backyard to do this program. You wouldn't need a large amount of green area to do the program. So if you have young people in your life that are into insects, I think that our Insect Adventures program would be very relevant to folks living within a suburban or urban area within the Northeast as well. I also get to teach. So I teach several courses in our grad curriculum. I teach grant writing, insect ecology, and presentation skills. So I always say, hopefully this is not the worst presentation you've heard, because I teach that on a regular basis. Okay, so I want to get to the technical content of the presentation. I'm gonna try to hide, there we go. I had to hide the meeting control so I can see my slides. Okay, so many people think about bees, and of course, maybe the first bee that comes to mind is the European honeybee. But what many don't realize is that within the United States, we actually have a very diverse bee fauna. And in the state of Ohio alone, there are about 500 bee species. And interestingly enough, about 20% or 107 species we've documented living within the city of Cleveland. And so before I get going into the meat of my vacant lot talk, I just want to highlight some of the diversity of the different bees that you might find within your own backyard within an urban area. So one group of bees are the bumblebees. This is the major group of native social bees that you're going to find within a city. Bombus are the bumblebees, and there's several species. Many are native to Ohio as well as the northeastern US. And these are social because they have a queen who lays the eggs and broods the offspring, but those offspring are cared for by female workers, which collect pollen and nectar and tend to the larvae. And so what you're seeing here in this picture is what a bumblebee hive looks like. There's workers tending to brood. Within these closed capsules are pupae. There's also honey pots of pollen and nectar here to feed those brood. And this would be found mostly underground within old rodent burrows or in other holes, sometimes under porches and things like that. And these are include some rare and threatened bee species. So there are some very common bumblebees as well as some very rare species. But the majority of bees that make up that 500 are solitary bees. And these include species that are both native to the United States as well as those that have been introduced. A solitary bee is a female bee that provisions her own nest. So she goes out and collects pollen and nectar, brings it back to a nest, and then lays her eggs within that nest. These bees are typically not aggressive at all. You would basically have to grab one. The only times I've ever been stung are when we have them in culture and I accidentally, smush one up against the side of a cage or something like that. And so in nature, they're out foraging around and they don't cause concern. And this is something important for us to communicate to our neighbors and friends who might be more fearful of bees and less aware of their value, that there are so many bees that really, are not going to harm us in any way. And these solitary bees also range from common to rare. I want to show some of the different ways these solitary bees make their living because it provides us with information about how we might manage our landscape to help them. So there are quite a few bees that are miners that dig burrows in the ground. And so these are going to have specific soil requirements where they make their nests. So each species might have slightly different, but here you can see a female coming out of the nest. And if you were able to see what was in there, they have a series of tunnels that inside have pollen and nectar balls with larvae that are feeding on that pollen and nectar. They make their cocoon and pupate down in that hole, and then the next summer they come up. There's also bees that nest in wood. So carpenter bees nest in wood or pithy stems. Here is the large carpenter bee. This can burrow right into wood, and this is the kind of tunnel that it would make. Each one of these would be a cell with a developing larva. And here we have a pith nesting bee, Ceratina. These really like to nest in soft stems like raspberry stems, for instance. They will burrow in here, take out the pith, and then make their nest inside. And you can see here some working on a nest. These vary a lot in size. So here's the carpenter bee and then that little pith nesting bee. There are also cavity nesters that take advantage of cavities that also already exist in the environment. These might be something like fissures in bark of a tree, old beetle burrows, all sorts of different cavities, even man-made ones like crevices around windows of a house, for instance, or those bee boxes that you can purchase and put out in your garden. Some cavity nesting bees are mason bees. So these will use mud to separate cells within the cavity. And here you can see this osmia has used mud to separate a pollen ball with an egg on it. And then over here we have a leaf cutting bee. These bees cut leaves from particular types of plants, roll them up, carry them like little maps back to their cavity, and then use them to create cells for their developing brood. And in the bottom picture, you can see an example of that. So these are all the bees that, are out among us. And so you can see that they need many different types of resources to be successful. And because of that, when we come in and we build our environment to support our way of life, it takes away some of those resources, right? And so habitat fragmentation that occurs from urbanization is a known driver of habitat decline and the loss of these resources for bees. And so because of that, we would predict that we're going to find fewer species in the city, more exotic species, because exotic species tend to have really general habitat requirements, which have facilitated their invasion into new areas. And also bees that are generalists, they can feed on a lot of different plants. So you don't need a very particular plant in a habitat to support them. But bees don't always follow the ecological literature. So when we look at this urban to rural gradient in this picture, we would predict that there would be more bees out in the rural area and fewer species as you move into the city. And certainly some people have found this in certain cities. But there are just as many studies that have found that as you move into a city, there are more species or the same number of species as you find in rural areas. And this is because, cities are not alike. If you go to New York City and then you come to Cleveland, we have 30,000 vacant lots. And we're a much smaller city. It's not the same environment. Likewise, around the world, every city has different ecological, social, biological, political, and cultural factors that influence its value for not just bees, but for all sorts of wildlife. And so, of course, we're going to see different patterns, and that makes it important to study bee communities in different types of cities to see what sorts of factors might influence them and promote conservation strategies to improve their habitat. And so over the course of my career, I've focused on shrinking cities as a novel habitat to study pollinators. Across the world, there are over 450 shrinking cities or cities that have lost significant population. And Cleveland is one such city. Cleveland was once the fifth largest city in the United States, but it's lost 50% of its peak population. And there are many shrinking cities located in the central and eastern US. Shown here are some examples. In New York, there are several shrinking cities, as you can see here. Cleveland is located in Northeast Ohio here on Lake Erie. And in Cleveland, about 36% of families fall below the poverty line of $23,000 a year. And so in these poor communities surrounding downtown Cleveland, we have a major challenge of home loss and home foreclosure and abandonment. And so over time, as people move out of these neighborhoods, there are vacant houses which are torn down to create vacant lots. And across Cleveland, there are 30,000 vacant lots, which is about 2,000 hectares of vacant land. And you can see here in this map of Cleveland, the city is outlined in gray. The green areas are historic parks like the metro parks and city parks. All of the red areas are vacant lots. And so the vacant lots have added substantially to the amount of green space that we have in Cleveland. And you can also see here in this map a close-up of that. So this is a major shift in the amount of green space that we have. And this is what that looks like on the ground. So here we have some abandoned houses that have been boarded up. These are awaiting teardown. This is what a teardown looks like. It's a pretty dramatic process ecologically and socially. After that happens, the city plants fescue grass or turf grass, which becomes a habitat of mixed weedy vegetation, which is mown monthly. And so over time, when I first moved to Ohio, I lived in the city of Akron, which is also a shrinking city. I would run by these vacant lots every morning, and I thought, this is really interesting. It looks like a lot of forage for bees. And so could these vacant lots be valuable bee habitat? So that's kind of where I started this, just wondering, if bees use these sites. And then I also thought about, well, if we could create this ideal habitat for bees, there's houses in the background, right? Like people are living in this area. It's not just an abandoned city. This is a thriving city too. It has its challenges like any place, but people are living, working, trying to improve their community. And so we also need to do this activity in a way that meets the aesthetics, values, and safety of the community that lives there. And that's a hard thing to do. But we wanted to give it a go. And so we worked with the community to develop a large project funded by the National Science Foundation. I started this in 2013, and it was a 7-year project called the Cleveland Pocket Prairie Project. And our goal was to establish a citywide field experiment to examine if we could create valuable habitat for beneficial insects that also was approved by the community, that people enjoy, that they wanted to be part of their neighborhood. We had several different habitats as part of this experiment, but I'm going to talk about 4 of them today, which were replicated on 8 sites, which created a network of 40 vacant lots. So for 7 years, I managed 40 vacant lots across Cleveland, which was a huge undertaking. These 4 treatments were a control treatment where the fescue grass was mown monthly. Then we also had a meadow treatment where we allowed the fescue grass to grow all summer and we mowed it in the fall. And we did that treatment because if you talk to people, their first inclination when they want to create pollinator habitat is, oh, we just need to stop mowing. Mowing's evil. We shouldn't mow. We should let stuff grow. So we thought, okay, well, we'll test that. Then we also wanted some more intensive treatments where we planted specific plants for bees. And so we had two different treatments. One was a flowering lawn, which is maybe more amenable to some urban settings where you don't want tall vegetation. So this was turf grasses with non-native low growing flowers in the turf grass. So things like clover. And then we also had a pocket prairie, which was a tall habitat of native Ohio wildflowers. So here's some pictures of what these treatments look like. So here's the control vacant lots that were mown monthly. And this is the meadow treatment that was mown annually. Here's the flowering lawn. And here's the pocket prairie. You can see in the background, that's a no parking sign. So this was quite tall vegetation, but very pretty. Okay, so just some background on, how did we do this? And feel free if you want to take pictures of any of these slides, or this will be available also on YouTube. But what we did, the first thing I would suggest, if you're going to plant a wildflower habitat on a vacant lot, I would highly suggest hiring an expert to plant the seeds or advise you on how to do so. So we had to do a bunch of these. And so I worked with Ohio Prairie Nursery, which is a local planting, a nursery of native plant seeds, and they managed the installation of our habitats. So they first herbicided the sites 3 times before planting. You don't have to herbicide. Certainly you could solarize the site by tarping, but we were doing a ton of different plots for this research experiment, and that was not feasible. So I needed to do that to get rid of some of the weed seed bank. Then we lightly tilled to incorporate compost and micronutrients in the fall of 2014. And then we just hand broadcast seeded both the low growing flowering lawn and the pocket prairie. The pocket prairie, well, the flowering lawn was supposed to be a no-mow lawn, but we quickly realized that wasn't going to work because the weedy plants within the site were taking over. So we ended up having to continue to mow the flowering lawn monthly. The pocket prairie was mown annually in October, but in the first year we cut it monthly at high. We cut it at like 8 inches tall. And that was again to try to reduce some of that weed pressure before we started just letting it grow totally the next year. So the big question was, well, will these plants establish? So after I planted in 2014, you can imagine the anxiety of driving around the whole city the next year and seeing not a single flower. And the next year, seeing not a single flower, and seeing, rosettes and thinking, okay, there's stuff there, but the whole site looked like a weed field. Then in 2017, it all bloomed. And so people told me it would take 3 years. It took 3 years. I was very hopeful that it wouldn't, but it did. So something to note if you're going to do this. Also, another question I get is, did everything establish that we planted? So I want to show you what we planted versus what established. So in the box at the left-hand side of the slide is what was present in the flowering lawn seed mix. And in the box at the right is what established, with the stuff that's bolded being the most dominant things. So with the flowering lawn mix, we did have all the plants that established did grow in some of the sites or all of the sites. But what I will say is over the course of the 7 years, these became clover lawns. So a lot of the plants that we saw early on were not present in all years. They became dominated by clover. So just thinking cost-wise, you might be better off just going for a clover lawn if a flowering lawn is the only option. However, there are many options for flowering lawns. With this particular seed mix, I did not see long-term retention of those different flowers. With the pocket prairies, we went with a really diverse seed mix, and we had 2 goals. First, there's a lot of great research that had already been done showing what plants were really attractive to bees and other beneficial insects. And so we took a look at all of those papers and figured out some different options. Then we decided we really wanted to have habitat for as long in the season as possible. So from very early spring to very late fall. Then we also had to consider what our local suppliers had available and what they thought would do well in an urban environment. And so at the left is the list that we came up with those considerations in mind. We did have some species that just did not establish in any sites. So the plants on the right are those that did establish in 1 or more sites, and those that are in bold establish in the majority of sites. So the ones in bold, I think, are really excellent plants that I can recommend for greening with native plants within an urban environment. The other thing to note is obviously we were not burning these lots because they are in an urban environment. And so unlike a prairie where you could manage with occasional burning to reduce the weed seed bank, you just can't do that. And mowing doesn't do as good of a job at doing that. So you are going to have weeds within a urban pocket prairie, and it's very important to communicate that to the community from the start so that people don't see it as a failure if there's some weeds present, because it's just impossible to control that. And here are some pictures of some of those plants that did really well, really lovely, lots of different colors, shapes, and textures. So you can create a really beautiful wildflower garden in the city. And here's what it looks like kind of all together. And I think this picture kind of captures what I'm talking about with the weeds. So here you see bee balm and coneflower, which are native plants. You also see Queen Anne's lace and chicory, which are non-native Eurasian weeds. But all of these plants provide pollen and nectar. They all can be forage for some bees. And so I think it's important for people to kind of have a positive spin on that, and not to say, well, this would be better if we were able to get rid of the chicory, because it's just not possible. So once we got our habitats established, we were set to figure out, well, do bees care what kind of habitat we create for them? Do they prefer these native pocket prairies, or are they just as happy within the vacant lots? And so to do this, we used two kinds of methods. We observed bees at each type of plant for 5 minutes, multiple times this summer, and we would collect them and determine the species that were there using these hand vacuums. We also put out small pan traps where bees would fall into these cups, which we would then collect. And we did this throughout the growing season for several years in these sites. So now I'm going to go through several questions. Let me hide these meeting controls again. Several questions that we used our data to answer. And so the first one was, does mowing frequency affect bees? So as I said earlier, there are a lot of people that are very passionate about stopping mowing. And to some extent, a lazy lawnmower effect might be great. And so we wanted to test this. So we had these two treatments, our control lawn that was mown once a month and our meadow that was mown once a year in October. And so our prediction was that mowing once a year would provide a habitat for a greater richness of bee species. But we actually found the opposite. There were fewer bee species in the meadow. For some reason I'm having issues with this mouse. There we go. The control vacant lots had a higher species richness of bees than the meadow. And the controls also had more flowers. And these pictures are, I selected to kind of illustrate what happened here. So in the meadow, there was a high grass abundance towards the end of the season. So there weren't a lot of flowers. So this was not a great habitat for bees. People also uniformly hated it. I got so many angry phone calls about the meadow treatment that after the first year, we nixed this treatment from our study design because it clearly was not amenable to an urban environment. People didn't like it. It was very controversial. And so I would not recommend this kind of management for most settings. Now, in certain situations where you maybe have a large area that's not, near where people are living, that can just be let to go into an old field, that could be great. But if you have small plots within where people are living, it just doesn't work. So no to the meadow. Now, we found that mowing once a month supports bees. And so of course you're going to have people say, well, great, so mowing's good, right? So I can mow like constantly. Well, no, obviously if we mow away all the flowering resources, that's also bad. So there's really kind of this sweet spot between not mowing at all during the summer and mowing all the time, where you're going to find you get a lot of value for bees. And so in vacant lots, mowing once a month seems to be great. Within yards, there's other ways to do this, such as leaving one small strip of flowering clover or something and allowing that to grow, or mowing part of your yard one week and the other part the next week. And so there's a lot of ways you might think about how to implement this in your setting. So our conservation takeaway here is that a lazy lawnmower approach to managing vacant lots promotes blooms and bees. So our next question was, okay, so crop control lots are great, but how do they stack up to flowering lawns and pocket prairies? We actually found a similar number of bee species across all of these habitats, which was really surprising to us. But what really mattered was across all the treatments, the number of flowers. So whether those flowers were native flowers, non-native planted flowers, or Eurasian weeds in a control lot, it was really the number, not the type, that mattered for bee species research. So the more flowers you had, the more bees you had in these sites. So our takeaway here is that it's the number of flowers, not the type, that matter most for urban bees. And some people might say that that's a real disappointing finding, but I actually think it's the opposite, because for one thing, pocket prairie is a beautiful habitat, as is a flowering lawn, but they're expensive to install and hard to maintain. And so if you have a group of very motivated people that want to install one of these someplace in the city, great. It can provide an awesome habitat, but there's a lot of other places where we might not have the resources to do that. And so understanding that the control lots also have value as habitat is great, because we have a lot of these and we can think about how to manage them in a way that supports bees without a lot of cost. And so I actually think it's a really important finding. But there's more to just understanding bee health in the city than just saying, oh, there's a lot of them there in the pan traps. And so we also wanted to say, well, how healthy are they? Are they doing well in these habitats? And so one way we could get at this was to look at whether the habitats improve their reproductive success. And I mentioned in the beginning that some bees nest in pre-existing cavities, and that includes those houses that you can purchase, at lawn care places and things. Well, there's also research traps that are similar to those that you can use to measure bee reproductive success within habitats. And so we created these little trap nests that had a variety of straws that bees could nest in, and we put them in different habitats to see whether or not the habitat influenced the number of larvae that female bees would produce in that site. What we would do is go every month and collect these straws, and then we would x-ray them. And in the x-ray, you can see the larvae developing and whether it's healthy. So here you have a bunch of larvae eating their pollen ball, and you can see that the one at the end of the straw is the largest. That's the oldest one. The one at the other end is the youngest. We would track these throughout the winter, allow them to emerge the next spring, and then see how many native bee larvae were produced within each of the sites. And so here are the results of that project. So we actually found here that the control lot and the flowering lawn had a similar number of native bee larvae produced, but the flowering pocket prairie had significantly more bee larvae produced. So the flowering pocket prairie did aid native bee reproductive success. So these prairies are doing something to encourage reproductive success with bees, with these cavity nesting bees, in a way that these other habitats are not. So this really does advocate for installing pocket prairies, in parts of the city where they do make sense. So our takeaway here is planting native plants will improve the reproductive success of cavity nesting bees. We don't know if it improves the reproductive success of other bee groups, but this is an encouraging finding, and more evidence that in your own garden, planting native plants can be really helpful to the bees that are able to utilize them. The next thing we wanted to know is, well, there's 30,000 vacant lots in Cleveland, and we could put a pocket prairie or maintain vacant land in any of them, right? We also need to think about maybe some of these sites being sites for redevelopment, for housing for people. And so if we're going to develop a conservation plan for the city, it's important to think about, well, how does the context matter? So within Cleveland, you have situations where you have a single vacant lot, like on this side of the screen, where there's houses on either side. Then you have other situations where vacant lots are in large patches. So what you're seeing here in these cement areas are driveways. So this used to have 4 or 5 houses, and now the whole block is vacant. So what this creates is landscapes with green areas that vary in their connectivity. So in some parts of the city where you have a lot of vacant land and not much housing or pavement, you have very connected green habitat. So that's what I'm showing in this figure. So this is a digitized air photo of a neighborhood in Cleveland with our vacant lot in the middle and a 1 kilometer buffer. And this is what we're calling a connected habitat. So there's a lot of green area. So all of the trees are in green and the grass and shrubs are in yellow. And you can see that there's a lot of areas where big patches connect as compared to what we're calling this isolated habitat over here. Again, our vacant lot is this little triangle in the middle, but here you have a lot of buildings and pavement, which are red and gray, and not very much green space. And so we wondered, across this foraging area, and for most bees, about a kilometer, about a little over half a mile encompasses their foraging area. Does the context of the site matter? Are we better off maintaining a vacant lot in an isolated habitat where there's not very much other habitat? Or is it better to have a vacant lot in an area that already has a lot of green habitat? Or does it not matter? So we tested this by looking at the diversity and abundance data that we had for each of our vacant lots. And we found that when our lots were in landscapes with greater green connectivity, we did have a higher bee richness. We also had more small bees, and this makes sense because in those isolated habitats, if you're a small bee, it's going to be harder for you to find an isolated green space and fly over things like buildings or large parking lots. So small bees thrived in these connected landscapes. We also had greater reproductive success of native bees. So if you were looking to invest in an expensive habitat like maintaining a pocket prairie, you might get more results by putting it in a landscape where there's already some green space there, so that it's not just an island unto itself, because it's going to be hard in that situation for bees to find the habitat. So our takeaway here is to target areas with high vacancy or nearby parks or large green spaces to add additional habitat, especially if you're going to be investing a lot of money and time into it. So about 3 years into working in these green spaces and spending most of my summers in Cleveland vacant lots, I started to really kind of connect what we were doing now with the industrial past of Cleveland. So all this is connected, right? So the reason that there's vacant lots in Cleveland is multifaceted, but a big component of it is changes in the economic structure of the city. So at one time, Cleveland was an industrial city. It was a leader in iron and steel production. And now it's a post-industrial city. And what's left behind from some of the manufacturing that did occur and still occurs to some extent is heavy metal contamination. And the thing about heavy metals is once they're there, they're there. They don't really degrade. They're stable in the soil. So we wondered, does this affect bees? So one of the first things we did was we went out to different vacant lots and not industrial sites, just residential vacant lots, and we put bumblebee hives out there. And then we also put them in a farming area near one of Ohio State's research campuses in Worcester, Ohio. And we wanted to see whether we found more contamination in the provisions, the pollen and nectar that bees collected in Cleveland compared to this farming area. And for sure, there were higher metal contamination. So when we screened the pollen and nectar, these are samples of the bee larvae and their provisions, we found higher levels of heavy metals than we did outside the city. But if you tested any animal, it's possible that it could have heavy metal contamination, but that doesn't mean necessarily that that's having a negative influence on its health. And so we wondered, do these contaminants affect bee health? So I had a graduate student who was really interested in this. And so she took the pollen and nectar provisions from Cleveland and she figured out how much contamination there was within those. And then she spiked nectar solutions with those field relevant contamination levels and exposed bees to those nectars in tents. And so she had these big flight tents on our research farm, and she fed the bees nectar that either was just nectar or it had arsenic, cadmium, chromium, or lead, which were the main metals we found in Cleveland. And then she also had nectar that had all of them. And you might think, geez, that's overkill. But actually, what we found in Cleveland was when there was high levels of one metal, they tended to co-occur. So you would have colonies that collected high levels of all of the metals or colonies that didn't really collect any metals. So the all was actually pretty field relevant. So what did we find? Well, we did have some mortality, even in the control hive. We had about 20% mortality, but when we added the field relevant levels of the metals, we did have 3 to 4 times the mortality, and the all treatment had 8 times or almost 9 times the mortality. This is just showing a healthy bee larvae versus a dead bee larvae, so it was very easy to assess mortality there. So our takeaway here is not to avoid conservation or give up, right? Because there's ways that you can deal with heavy metals. And the first thing to do is always soil test your site, and don't test it just in the middle, test a whole bunch of areas, because heavy metal contamination can be concentrated, and avoid those sites. We're also currently working on some soil blends with a company here in Ohio to try to reduce the bioavailability of these metals. So that could be added when a house is taken down for a low cost. So we're really excited about some future results there. But I want to kind of end with something that people always ask me when I give these presentations. So that's important about the bees, but how can communities approach this? What did people think about the vacant lot project that you did, and does it have long-term feasibility? How do we make people and bees work together, get what they need out of these habitats? Is a challenging thing. So the first thing that probably won't surprise anyone is that people really vary in what they want their green spaces to look like. So quite a few people don't like tall vegetation. I mentioned this about the meadow habitats. It's not acceptable to everyone. So every year in the spring in Cleveland, we get a ton of rain, and every year that delays mowing by the city. So every year on the news, you have stories like this. East Side residents want Cleveland to mow the lots. They're too tall. So people get mad because the city's not out there mowing. So high vegetation, not always going to work for people. Also, not everyone thinks creating habitat for bees and wildlife is a good idea. This is why I mentioned in the beginning. I think as conservation-minded folks, when we go out and talk to people, it's very important to note that bees do not pose a large risk and things like that, because many people are extremely fearful of bees. And so when we're doing this kind of work, we can focus on designs and landscapes and pollution aspects, but it's really co-creating with the community and engaging people in this process that's going to matter for the longevity of the conservation effort. And so there's a few things that you can do when you're designing habitats like this that are going to make them probably more accepted by people. So there's a large body of literature from Joan Nassauer about incorporating cues to care. Cues to care are things that illustrate a design of a habitat being purposeful. And many of the cues to care that Joan talks about are encompassed in this photo on this side of the slide, which is an affluent area of Columbus, actually. And you can see here that there are nice pavers, there's very clean borders, colorful flowering plants, lots of different textures, green grass, trees, benches. It's very safe in this area, etc. So if I could make vacant lots look like this, that would be amazing. And we would love to do that. The problem is, in a city with a very declining tax base, with small crews to do this work, there's just no way you can do this. And so at the beginning, I was very naive about how to incorporate cues to care. And I thought, I can take this and our group can do this. And so here we have our attempt, and it's sad, but we did this. Was $1 million project, and this was still the amount of cues to care that we were able to maintain in 40 sites. So we had mulch. We wanted to do a fence around the whole site, but the city decided that they wanted to charge me a fencing permit per site. I think they saw an opportunity to get some additional funding. So we lost our entire fence budget and ended up with this. We had signs. We ended up mowing a border around the edge, and we had colorful flowering vegetation. And some people thought they were awesome, and some people thought they were hideous. So it was very controversial. Aesthetics matter, right? So we had a lot of problems with people not liking the weeds within the habitat. We also had issues, they don't bloom all year in Cleveland, right? We get a lot of snow like you guys do. So in the spring, after it starts to warm up, you have a green period where the plants are growing, but they're not blooming. This would create a lot of phone calls asking us to mow our weeds. Why are they not blooming? Also in the fall, when you have dry down before we would mow, we would get a lot of calls as well. So, it's very hard to reconcile aesthetics. So you have everything from people loving that messy prairie look to people wanting the neat, attractive look of fake flowers around our sites. And so it's really, really challenging to please everyone. In addition to aesthetic challenges, we also had a lot of challenges with costs associated with vandalizing and dumping. And I bring this up just because if people are thinking about doing this, you really need to budget for it, which is hard to know but until you do it. But there's a lot of costs in replacing sampling equipment that people took out anger on, and signs took a big hit in our project. We also would find a lot of mattresses, tires, garbage. I ended up renting a dump truck once a year. When there's a lot of snow in Cleveland, we tend to have people dump larger items within the lots. And so in the spring, before the plants would grow, we would go and remove that stuff. It's also hard to find people to do good contract work with mowing. I found it to be impossible. So every year of the project, for the first 3 years, I hired a new contractor because I wasn't happy with the last one. But we would still get stuff like uneven edges. So this was supposed to be a square border, but people wouldn't do it right. Or here we had someone mow through the middle of the lot. And this was like week to week. Like every time I would pick up the phone and hear these stories, I would think, how did this happen? But yet it did. And so finally in year 3, I ended up buying my own mowing equipment so I could just mow the 40 sites myself and maintain them. And when someone would call with a complaint, I could be on it right away rather than calling a contractor. It was actually less expensive, but obviously more time consuming to do that, but it worked a lot better for us. Another real big challenge that's hard to overcome is challenges associated with real or perceived fear of crime. So I'm going to give one example of this. In this picture here, picture A, we have a vacant lot that I placed in a poor spot without really realizing it. There's a bus stop at the corner of this street. It's a pretty major road, but then the road in front of the site is a neighborhood. So people would walk out of the neighborhood to the bus stop. There was some crime issues with this gas station that's in the back of the lot, which we didn't know about at the time of putting in the lot. In the second picture, you see in the yellow shirt, my graduate student, Denisha, she's 5'6", and she's with 2 kids. This is a field day that we did for youth in this particular lot one day. And so you can see that their heads are above the vegetation, but it is quite tall still. And we had someone, a city council person, contact me to let me know that a woman was afraid to walk to the bus because she thought someone was hiding in the plants. And she was worried about getting robbed or worse, going to work. And so when you have something like that happen, you have to respond immediately. And so we ended up mowing and removing this site because it just wasn't in a good spot. And if people are feeling that way, it wasn't meeting that balance, right? It wasn't meeting the needs of the community and the bees. And while, there wasn't anybody necessarily in the plot hiding, it's just the thought, if someone's thinking there is, that's kind of enough, right? That it's not a good thing, because there is a lot of crime within some of the areas where these vacant lots are. Sadly, a young person was shot just around the corner, which is that memorial to this site. So she was right to be worried that there could be somebody there. So just something to think about, when you're working, it's really important to work with the community, because even though we did talk to people, nobody brought up the gas station. Maybe if we had gone, and talked to a few more residents in this particular neighborhood, beyond the few that were right around the site, we would have learned more about some history and maybe move the site to a better location. So there's something that you really should think about. So some takeaways here. The first thing is that everyone's opinion matters. So one thing I hear from a lot of really well-meaning conservation people is that, well, my neighbors, they just don't get it. So they'll come along, they'll figure it out. And yeah, maybe they will, or maybe they'll call the city on you and tell you to mow your yard. And so I think it's really, really important to try to build a coalition to do this and to bring people along and to figure out what everybody wants, rather than asking someone to accept it later. It's just not a good strategy for any sort of project, right? So you want to build a team that includes neighbors, the city leaders, land use planners, conservation people, anybody that's going to be engaged in the property. Don't establish something and then ask it to be accepted. Also consider a long-term plan and budget for site management. So my project was a research and demonstration project. It's been picked up by several cities in Ohio, which now have pocket prairies and different types of strategies for managing their vacant lots. But we never planned to maintain it for years and years ourselves because of the cost. So I had a large budget. It ran for 7 years. That allowed us to respond to complaints and concerns that people had. But a function to be able to do that long term is needed if you want it to last. So I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation and that it's brought some new information about vacant lots that you can use in your own community. I want to acknowledge my awesome grad students, the Cleveland residents that provided so much help to us with this project, all the students that worked so hard on it over the years, our partners, and all of the funding that supported me. And I would be happy to answer any questions that you have. And my email is there as well if you would like to contact me. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was awesome. There was so much. We have a few questions in the chat right now. So the first one, and then also if you asked a question in the chat and I'm about to read it and you want to ask it yourself, you can feel free to unmute yourself. Chris asked a question. You want to unmute yourself, Chris? Okay.
Hi.
Nice. Hey, go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the things that you were looking at, the heavy metals in the sort of the captive colonies of bumblebees, but they were in the open settings, not in the tents. And you were finding heavy metals in those nests. So kind of two questions. One is, were the levels significant to affect reproduction based on your other testing of what levels were significant? And how do you think they might be getting these heavy metals into their system? Is it being taken up by the plants into the flowers? Is it contact with soil, etc.?
Great questions. So first, I don't think I explained this super good. Can he hear me? Can you guys hear me still? Okay. Okay. So what we did was we went out first to Cleveland and we figured out how much heavy metal contamination they naturally collected in urban sites. And then we used those levels to make those sugar solutions. So the mortality that we got in those tents was based on the sugar solutions that we had from the field. Now, it's still not a perfect test, right? Because they could maybe go and eat some other sugar, some other pollen and nectar that wasn't contaminated, where we were forcing them. But I think it does show that even at field relevant concentrations of heavy metals, there can be reproductive effects. The second question was, well, how did it get there? Which is my question. As soon as we found this, I was fascinated to figure out, because to be able to deal with it, you have to figure out how they're getting it, right? So you pick the two possibilities. So it's either getting taken up by the plant and it's in the resources, or it's in the soil. And if it's in the soil, they could encounter it because dust can attract to those pollen collecting hairs, and then it can be groomed into the food. Dust could get in the pollen and nectar and be eaten. So there's a lot of ways they could encounter dust. So we are starting to get at that. The first thing that we did was we went out to Cleveland, we collected a ton of flowers, we spun them down, we're screening the nectar, and we are finding heavy metals in the nectar. So unfortunately, a lot of these plants can take up the heavy metals in the nectar. So it could be both, but I think one of the things that we're trying is we have this group of soil blends that we're developing with a company. We're planting plants that we know will take up heavy metals in those blends to see if we can reduce it. And if we can, then we think that's a real game changer. Right now, what I would suggest is soil testing lots. And if you have lots that are high for heavy metals, I would suggest mowing them frequently to try to reduce the use of those lots. Whereas lots that don't have heavy metals could be allowed to grow. So that's, you know, one strategy, because they do take up the metals.
Great. Thank you for that answer. And then Chris, before we go, do you want to ask your second question and we can then move on to other question asker.
Yeah, I actually was having trouble with my audio, so I missed some of what you were saying, but I think I'm okay now. Oh, so one of the parts that's really interesting to me is the community involvement or engagement. And you mentioned that you did meet with members of the community before placing sites to make sure that
Correct.
they're going to have some level of acceptance and not get immediately trashed. But the long-term maintenance, once the funding is done, was there interest from community members in taking over any of the sites, and any kind of insights into that, like how to really make it a community resource and asset?
Great question again. So first off, what we did, I didn't go into a ton of detail about what we did, but what we did was we canvassed a city block around each lot before we installed it to make sure that no one had a significant concern. And we moved lots because people did in some instances. But the problem is in a lot of the neighborhoods, it's mostly rentals. And so with a long-term study, everyone's like, cool, this is going to be great. And then the next year it's there and half the people in the neighborhood just moved in and they're like, what's this? And I don't want this. And so you have a lot of turnover. It's very hard to keep up, especially because I'm one person. And I think at the biggest lab, I had maybe 20 people in my group. So, I mean, we were just like running with 2 vans trying to keep above water. So that was a huge challenge and something I didn't anticipate. What I have learned from it is that instead of installing things and trying to find everybody come together, you really have to have the community want the habitat first and say, we want to manage this. Will you help us put it in? And so when I finished this project, I finished the project right before the pandemic, which was a blessing. I was sad to finish it, but then we could have never maintained it during the pandemic. But as the pandemic was waning, I got to give a presentation at the Cleveland Botanical Gardens, and a couple groups came from East Cleveland, Cleveland Heights, which are suburbs of Cleveland. And they also have a lot of vacant lots. And they said, we really like what you're doing, but why aren't you doing it in people's front yards? We think it would be very cool to put these plants in established houses. And we could maintain it then easier because we can't maintain the vacant lots. The vacant lots, no one wants to go in those because there's debris and things. And I thought that's an excellent idea. And so I worked with this community group and some social science faculty, and Joan Nassauer, who I mentioned, who's an expert in landscape architecture. And we worked together on another NSF grant to study social and ecological effects of greening front yards for pollinators. So this is a new project that will start this year. And that's kind of where we're taking this. So the vacant lots, we really feel are great if communities rally around particular lots and they want to manage them. But we really think we can get more win-win benefits for people and pollinators by greening front yards, because that is a habitat where we can create more of a garden environment. And by connecting several houses, you might be able to create some social cohesion on streets as well. So just another thing to think about, when you're trying to start a project and you maybe want to start small, maybe working in a couple front yards could be a good way to go, or an individual vacant lot. Doing 40 probably isn't something I'd recommend for anyone's sanity, frankly, but it was fun.
So just an anecdotal datum that my background is my front yard.
I can see, I thought that's
Yeah.
awesome.
And I get a lot of feedback from just people walking around the neighborhood of how much they enjoy it, and they thank me for it, and say they walk down my block just to pass by this garden and stuff like that. So, in different neighborhoods it would be different, but in my neighborhood at least, it's seen as a neighborhood asset.
And I think that's true. I have a similar aesthetic in my yard, and I think that's true more and more. I think people are really gaining appreciation for more of a natural landscape. And it can be a template for ideas too in a neighborhood. You're walking down the sidewalk, you see something like your front yard, you get ideas. And so I think that people can understand that a little bit more than a vacant lot setting of native plants, because they just can't figure then how to put that in their own space maybe. And so it can maybe have a larger impact on the community because it could be adopted by more people. So I'm excited about that aspect of greening front yards too.
Wonderful. Barbara Gerson asked a question. Barbara, if you want to unmute yourself, I'll give you a few seconds. All right. They asked, could it be that you were unable to count and observe the numbers of bees in the meadow because of physical inaccessibility of meadows?
Oh no, we tromped through the meadows. That's a good question. So we put our same, the reason that those little, it's hard to see in my picture, the reason that our little traps were elevated was because of the height of the meadows and the pocket prairies. We had to make sure the traps were above the vegetation, all the sites, because that is an issue. If you put traps on the ground in a tall vegetation, you're not going to catch anything. And I actually caught one of my grad students doing that this summer. And I'm like, you know that you can't put those on the ground because it's a pain to make those little platform things. But that's why we do it, because yeah, the vegetation height. Now, could there be some interaction between vegetation height and the traps? Absolutely. But I can tell you from spending a lot of time monitoring flowers in the meadows, there just weren't many flowers. And so that could vary. Like maybe in my setting, there weren't a lot, but in your setting, you are getting a lot of flowers in a meadow. It can vary. There's also succession of meadows. So over time, you know, there's going to be more woody plants. Some of those might have flowers, but for us, it was really the feedback. I mean, people were very adamant that they didn't like the meadows. And so that kind of sealed the deal on the meadows.
Great. Okay, Natalia asked a question. Natalia, do you want to?
Oh, hi. Yeah, no, great talk. Very interesting. So my question has two parts. So I was wondering, so how far can a bee can travel for food, right? Because you were talking about like creating these gardens in areas that they don't have like a lot of heavy metals, but you could have another plot or another area, right, with like natural vegetation growing with flowers, and the bees will go there as well and feed, right, and get those heavy metals. And then the second part of my question is like, how high can bees travel? Like I was in a bar in Manhattan the other day with a beautiful vertical garden, and there was a bee feeding from the flowers, and I was like, wow, that's pretty amazing, because I have heard about research that says that green roofs increase the bird diversity in cities, but I never thought about, like, for instance, insects, right? So yeah, those are my two questions.
Those are great questions. So I'll tackle the first one because so dispersal is very interesting. So some bees, some small bees can only move maybe 200 meters. So that's like a couple yards. So for those bees, your yard might be it, you know? And I think that's something really important to think about, that certain things are really, really dependent on us as stewards. Now, other bees can move miles. So a large bumblebee can fly a few miles away from its central nest. And in that case, I think your question was, well, if I manage heavy metals locally, but then the bees are going to other sites that might have heavy metals, they're going to get contaminated. And that's one of the real big challenges with heavy metal contamination, because it's widespread and it's patchy, and we don't know a lot about its distribution in most cities. So I think that is a big challenge. I don't have an answer for you other than to say that it is a problem and something that we really need to start managing at teardown. As we're taking stuff down, we need to figure out if things are contaminated and figure out low-cost ways to remediate, because after the fact, it's very hard. In terms of height, now you all have much taller buildings than we have in Cleveland, so I don't know for sure that I can answer this, but I can say some people put bumblebees up on green roofs, or I mean honeybee colonies. So in those cases, the honeybees will forage the green roof for sure. Now, there are bees that will naturally be able to go up on top of a green roof. And I have seen some papers of like 10 to 12 stories up, you know, green roofs and different bee diversity. But in terms of, you know, how vertically, how high can they go? I don't know. Now, some might even nest up there, depending on the bee. We have a green roof on campus, and we have soil nesting bees that have actually nested on our green roof. So in some cases, they're living up there to some extent. So it definitely is possible.
Wonderful. Let's see. So lots of people saying great job and thank you for
Always take that. Thanks, guys.
It looks like Jill has a question. Okay.
Oh, here I am.
Okay,
Can
Jill.
you hear me? Hi there. Yes. Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's a really wonderful presentation. And I just wondered about, there have been a lot of, in Manhattan, a lot of efforts to understand the natural history, like where there was water, where there was fields, where there were forests. And so I was wondering, did that that historical perspective have any bearing on on your project in terms of what was originally the habitats in Cleveland?
That's an awesome question. And Cleveland has a really amazing network of metro parks, and there is quite a bit of natural history known about how those metro parks once were connected and the other types of habitats that were in Cleveland, as well as a lot of restoration efforts on the river systems in the city. And so to a certain extent, yes, we do know quite a bit about what used to be there. In terms of my particular project, we were really focused more on the current landscape elements that were there and how those elements would influence the habitats that we put into the city. So what we did was we picked sites all around the center of the city. And then within each neighborhood, we put one of each treatment of our habitats. And so it was more of like a research focused study design rather than say putting particular plants in an area that used to be riparian, or putting particular plants in an area that was like upland deciduous forest to replace those. That would be an awesome thing to do. That's just not what we did. We put the same plants in all of the plots, but restoration efforts are definitely ongoing in Cleveland by the Metro Parks and other groups.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. That's exactly what I was wondering. And the final thing was, when you worked on this, did you have what is the city's long-term idea for these tear down areas? Like, did you have a time limit that you were looking at in terms of realizing that you would only have this for a limited time? And
correct. So I leased these lots for 7 years from the city. We paid $1 for the lots, but that $1 was just part of a contract because I was legally responsible for maintaining the lots and anything that would happen in the lots. So that was actually a little bit of a lengthy process between Ohio State and the city to set that all up. And every city is different. So if you go to get vacant land from a land bank in different cities, they have different procedures. So before planning something, it's very important to look into that. For us, we knew we were giving the lots back in 7 years. And so the agreement was that we would take down our fencing and mow all the sites and return it in the fall of the 7th year as a mowed lot to the city. So that's what we did.
wow, thank you. Great.
Great, thank you, Jill. Christine Johnson has looks like a comment and a question. All right, they said, thank you. This was informative.
Oh, wait, yeah, here we go. Sorry, I couldn't find my mute thing. So yeah, this was a great presentation. It's a really great study. I really enjoyed it a lot from so many perspectives, from the ecological to the socioecological. I am not a botanist, but I am a community gardener. And I guess my thought is, or my understanding is that basically these plants don't really take up toxins unless they're like root vegetables or like sunflowers or mustard greens, something that's lower to the ground. And if the bees, to me, it seems like they may be more likely to be getting the toxins from the dust. Wouldn't it be better to maybe mow less and actually continue to like build that barrier between the soil and the rest of the world to reduce the exposure of the lead or the lead and the other toxins to people. And could you argue that in your proposal for management?
Right, very important. So yes, I think that, so there are several ways that you can reduce bioavailability and contamination by lead and other heavy metals, one of which is mulching or adding compost to soil. So I think you're right that those are good strategies. The problem is that we've found out that the plants are also taking up the metals from the soil. And the way that I know that is that we've grown white clover and red clover in the greenhouse where we've eliminated wind and other ways that the metals could get into the flowers. And then we've cut the flowers and spun them down and found lead in the flowers.
Okay.
So they also are able to take it up. So I think we need a two-part strategy where we're managing the soil environment to reduce the bioavailability of the metals into the roots, as well as reducing the dust exposure to people and animals that might encounter it in an urban environment.
Right, yeah.
Definitely, like mulching in a community garden setting, mulching is a great way to reduce dust exposure.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christine. It looks like Jack has a question.
Yes. Thanks, Dr. Gardiner. That was just a terrific talk. You've given me so much to think about. Several of us live on a small urban island next to Manhattan that's called Roosevelt Island. It's about 2 miles long and a couple city blocks wide. And we've been trying to plant native plants in underused areas on the island. These are public areas. We get permission from the folks who control the land. And recently we did a large cherry tree bed that was about 90 feet by 50 feet, about 1,500 native plants.
Wow.
But yeah, it's pretty cool. We'll see how they do over the next years. My question, I'm very interested in how these plantings might impact the native or the insect population on the island, or that would visit that particular plot. And you know, we're kind of a citizen scientists, so we may not have the rigor of what you're able to do in your realm. But any ideas about how we might go about looking at the impact on insect populations in those beds, like pre and post?
Great. I wrote down Roosevelt Island because I've never been to New York, and it would be cool to come and see that.
Oh my gosh, by all means.
So well, there's a lot of things you could do that are fairly straightforward. So if you haven't planted anything yet, iNaturalist is a great tool. And I know Lydia mentioned iNaturalist with the Galling project. So you all are familiar with using that. So if you set up a replicated way of collecting data, so say we're going to go out to the site, and before we plant, we're going to figure out what's blooming, you know, at certain times of the summer. And we're going to monitor those plants, and we're going to photograph what we find, and we're going to upload it to iNaturalist. Well, people could tell you what was there, and that's the great thing about iNaturalist, right? Well, then if you go back after you've planted your plants and they're in bloom at the same kind of periods, maybe once a month, May, June, July, August or something, and do the same thing, we're going to look at what's blooming. You could easily see, you know, well, what's using the resources that were there before versus what's using the resources now. That would probably be how I would go about it if you have a whole bunch of people helping. And you could try to kind of make sure, you know, like if you have 5 people monitoring each plant in the pre-assessment, then have the same number of people monitoring each flower type, you know, you could get kind of crazy with it, but you could also just do a bio and like go out and see what's there. And I think either way, it would be very interesting.
Oh, that's a terrific idea. Plus, it's very engaging because one of the things we've been doing is getting the community to plant the plants. So we've had children, families come out and do the planting. It's supervised, of course, but they're doing that. So that could be a follow-up project for them as well.
I think it would be a great follow-up. And actually, we're planting a series of pollinator gardens with schools today, and I couldn't go because I have COVID. So I have all these pictures on my phone of kids out planting plants and having a good time. So I think it would be a great, and they all have phones. They could take pictures of
Yes.
insects and do iNaturalist. I think that's a great idea.
Fantastic. And I'll keep you updated.
Okay, good. Please do.
All
Tell
right.
me
Thank
what's
you.
going on. Send me a picture.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, Jack.
Sure.
I have just a quick question. I know that your metric for the health of the area, or I guess an indicator of the health of the area, was just the diversity of bee species. But were there any particular species that you know of that are maybe a more important indicator of some sort of ecosystem, like maybe bees that you noticed that maybe only forage healthy ecosystems? I mean,
Well, one thing, that's a great question. So one thing that we did during COVID, every field biologist was like, what am I supposed to do? Like, I can't go to the field. So what do I do? So one of the things that we did was we had always focused on Cleveland, what's in Cleveland, but we had never focused on what's not in Cleveland. So what can't live there?
Mhm.
So during COVID, we worked with a bee taxonomist to figure out all of the bees that live in Ohio and a lot of their important traits. So for each bee, we figured out, say, how specialized was it? Did it feed on a lot of host plants or just anything? How did it nest? Did it nest in the soil? How big was it? All sorts of different traits. And then we looked at what sorts of traits do we see over and underrepresented in our lots versus the species pool for the whole state. And some patterns that we saw that were not super surprising, but things to work on was there was fewer specialists than you would expect by chance in the city. So figuring out bees that have very particular host plants and establishing those plants can be a good test of, can bees overcome some of the challenges of urbanization if their host plants are present? So I think more resources for people, you can get those kind of host plant data for butterflies really easy as like a home gardener, but we don't do as good of a job maybe providing people with information for bees. We also had fewer large bees than we would expect. And what that's telling me is that there's not big enough patches of habitat to support some larger bee species, like some of the bumblebee species. I'm trying to think of what some of the other patterns were off the top of my head, but I think those are two things for sure that we saw. We also saw more non-native species than you would expect by chance, which is not a surprise because non-native species tend to be found in cities. We actually had the first North American record of a bee species. This is kind of an unfortunate story. So with bee identification, it's very challenging. So even if you're an expert, there are a few people in the country that are like amazing resources. And so what we do, because I am not an expert, is I'm an ecologist, but not a bee taxonomist. So I take my bees to this professor, Dr. Sam Droege in Washington, D.C. Awesome, really friendly, helps us with everything, just the best guy and like the smartest guy. So he's going through our bee collection. And most stuff don't surprise him because he's been doing this forever. So he's quickly telling me all the bees I misidentified and fixing them and helping. And then all of a sudden he's like, oh, wow. And I'm like, oh, we found like a rare thing. This is wonderful. It was the first North American record of an exotic bee species. So it was cool in the sense of interesting that we found it, but it was not a rare or threatened native bee species. It was an exotic bee. So I was disappointed, but nonetheless, important data, right? Because we can track the spread of these non-native bee species.
That makes a lot of sense to me that these sort of like short-term vacant lots would also host bee species that maybe were more generalist.
Right.
Or things like that.
Because they're what's in the city to start.
Great. Does anybody else have any questions or comments before we wrap it up?
Oh, somebody's asking for my email. I'm going to just go ahead and put that in the chat for people before we wrap up.
Oh, I threw it in there.
Oh, cool. Oh, yeah, it's right there. I'm starting to fade with the COVID. I'm starting to lose my mind. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mary. It was really, really interesting and awesome. Lots of great participation from the audience. That was awesome. Yeah.
Thanks, you guys. It was really fun. I've never got to talk to a group from New York, so I really appreciate the opportunity. And thanks for coming. Thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you.
Take
Yeah.
care.